Speech, which is also part of our research project, has an exciting collection of speakers. You are all invited to come. Or invited doesn't mean that I'm going to pay for your visit, but we are great hosts, and if you want to know the meaning of party, you have to go farther south in Spain. So you should attend after you have the time. So just keep that web page in mind. And now, because we are not using the PowerPoint, we have a handout. I will close it to prevent distractions. Well, the title of this talk is Shaping Our Own Mind, and what we want to do is to connect different strands of research. The first one comes from the recent work by Joel Proust on metacognition. The second from the theory that Savitsky calls mind shaping. The work by Proust, the Proust approaches the problem of explaining metacognition by dividing theories in two main camps. One of the camps she calls the self-attributive view of metacognition, the other the self-evaluative view. The self-attributive view considers metacognition as something that involves reading your own mind to get some knowledge, and this involves meta-representation, meta-representing your own mental states. This is the most the standard way of considering the theory of knowing about and attributing mental states to others. What is typically called the mind reading view. And the other view that she actually holds is the self-evaluative view of metacognition, that holds that metacognition is not a matter of knowledge, it is a matter of controlling your own mind. For instance, evaluation is a particular kind of controlling your mental states that doesn't require knowing the contents of your mental states, or even less representing those contents. Well, the second strand of research that we want to connect to this problem is the theory known as mind shaping. Well, actually, the term mind shaping is not by Savitsky, it's from Mameli, but we are going to consider Savitsky's book more extensively because he offers a bigger development of the theory. Now, this is a theory of social cognition alternative to mind reading. So if this is an alternative to mind reading, what we thought is that it could perhaps be used also with respect to the role of mind reading in theories of metacognition. So his view is not, the work of Savitsky is not a work on metacognition, but offers a framework that can be adapted to deal with metacognition. And this is our goal in this talk. So what we want to do is to present a development from this theory, from the theory of mind shaping, that is, first, a genuinely metacognitive theory, in that it really addresses metacognition, that you can see the cognitive elements in it. And second, that it is an alternative to those two approaches to metacognition that are outlined by Joel Proust. And we are going to call this development of ours the self-mind shaping view. So, in a nutshell, mind shaping tries to provide an account for the origins, not of thought in general, but of social cognition in particular. So the idea is that by the mechanism mind shaping would be the basic mechanism by which other, perhaps mind reading abilities would appear. And the general point is that the purpose of this mechanism, the mind shaping mechanisms, is to make mental states and behavior predictable or more predictable in the social media. So the self-mind shaping view that we are going to argue for tries to account for the origin of metacognitive thought. And it will be at the same time a theory of metacognitive thought that will reflect on the social properties that the mind-shaping view tries to build onto cognition. So the purpose of self-mind shaping would not be to make mental states or behavior in general predictable, but to make your own mental states and your own behavior predictable. So the idea is that if you have some notion about your own mind, it's not because it is more transparent for you in some respect, but because in some sense you made it up. You made up your own mind, and in making your mind up, you also build in the social constraints that mind-shaping mechanisms have with them. So the structure of the talk, in the second section I will present the contrast between self-attribution and self-evaluation by Gerald Proust. That will be like the basic framework of two metacognitive theories. Then I will present some basic points about mind-shaping theory. And then in section 4, we will, then Víctor will be in charge of presenting self-mind shaping as a metacognitive theory. And then the last section will try to contrast the explanatory capabilities of these self-mind shaping theories as opposed to the self-attributive and the self-evaluative views, so as to show that it is a real alternative. So the real narrations begin in section 4 and 5. This is good for me because then you can shoot all the difficult questions to Víctor, who is going to present those parts, and I'm going to. So to begin with Joel Proust's account. Well, first, Proust begins by noting that there is too much variation in the use of metacognitions, too many things stuffed in a single term. There are questions about knowledge of your mind. How do you know about your own mental states? How I know that I am in this particular emotional stage or in this particular proposition attitude. On the other hand, in metacognition, there are also questions about controlling your mental states, the ability that I have to direct my own thinking in some direction and not another. What we are going to do to not to provide a definition of metacognition, but just to show what we think is important about metacognition, we are going to use a term like access that is something intended as intermediate between the knowledge approach and the controlling approach. So what we want to defend is that to count as metacognitive, the process must involve access to your mental states that is conceptually mediated. So this notion of access is a sort of more or less neutral term that tries to encompass both knowing or controlling your mind and this is the original part, perhaps something that is not reducible to any of those alternatives, knowing or controlling, but something that is knowing and controlling at the same time. And the second point about conceptually mediated, we think that to avoid the problem of possible pan-metacognitivism, that you have metacognition everywhere, that access must be governed by concept-consuming processes. We consider regard cognition as something that involves concepts. So let us then adapt Proust contrasts self-attributive view and the self-evaluative view in 4 claims. We are adapting them to the term access that provide the contrast between those 2 claims. So the first claim, so we are adapting them in terms of questions that they have to answer. The first question is, are mechanisms for accessing your own mental states the same as those for accessing others' mental states? The self-attributive view would answer yes, the mechanisms are the same, because they are mechanisms to represent mental states. In general, they are representational mechanisms. Well, there is room to, I will mention later that the answers to those questions can be questionable in the sense that depending on how you understand the same, you would perhaps a different answer. But the point from Proust's perspective is that the fact that they are representational mechanisms is the most important characteristic of those, the self-attributive view. Whereas the self-evaluative view answers that the mechanisms are different. The means to regulate my mind are different from the means I have to regulate the minds of other people. So they are based on different and possibly different mechanisms. The second question has to do with whether access to our mental states relies on propositions. And again, the self-attributive view would answer yes, that accessing our mental states involves meta representing propositional attitudes and the contents of those attitudes. If I have the propositional attitude, I hope that be, and I have knowledge that I hope that be, then I'm representing the propositional attitude and the content P. So it involves propositions. And the self-evaluative view answers that there can be a kind of access to our mental states, in particular a kind of controlling our mental states, that is procedural, it is a sort of procedural access that doesn't need to represent contents. We can imagine that you have these propositional attitudes, you don't have access to the content itself, you are not representing the content, but you can, so to speak, move the representation of the propositional attitude around. Okay, so you don't need to have a representation of the propositions to do that. The third question is whether access as control require access as representation. Again, the self-attributive view says that the answer is affirmative. To control a mental state, you need to represent it correctly. If I have the right representation of your mind, then I will be able to control your mind in a better way than if I have the wrong representation of your mental states. So, in order to have effective control of minds, you need to have a good representation of those minds. And this applies also to the self case. If I have the right representation of my own mental states, then I will be able to modify them appropriately. The self-evaluative view thinks, on the contrary, that some control processes, at least, don't require representing the controlled state at all. They can be based on states that take the process globally, not the representation, the specific representations of the mental states. And the fourth question is whether access to our mental states is inherently associated to mental action. Here, the self-attributive view would answer negatively. Accessing your mind is having knowledge of your own mind that you may or may not use. It's not linked necessarily to action. Just as knowing about your mind is not necessarily linked to control of your mind. I may use that knowledge as like a separation of theoretical and practical knowledge, so to speak. I mean, I have some kind of theoretical knowledge that I can put to some use or not. But in the self-evaluative view, this is in particular Proust's position, that perhaps other self-evaluative views that don't buy this idea. There is a procedural self-evaluation that is linked to each instance of mental agency, and in particular she draws from the notion of noetic feelings that have non-conceptual in nature, that are able to that provide a sort of evaluation of the feeling that you have of well, this is something that is can I remember when the Battle of Hastings took place? Yes, yeah, I know I was in Hastings at some point. Perhaps I can remember this. Can I remember when I don't know somebody famous was born? No, I don't know anything about this guy, so I know something about what I know. I have the feeling that guides me in tasks like this, associated to the mental action that I can take. So I think that we think that 2 points to note about these 4 claims is that even though Proust thinks that they are more or less constraining each other in terms of presenting a kind of syndrome that that is the self-attributed view or the self-evaluative view, they perhaps are independent claims. So you could have different intermediate positions that say that the mechanisms for accessing your own mental states are the same as those for accessing others, but that deny that those mechanisms rely on propositions. Or the contrary, you have different possibilities that give you intermediate positions, and we mention this just to prevent from misunderstanding of what we are going to present, because this is not the position that we are going to this is not the position that we want to defend. This is not that what we want to defend is not something like a hybrid between the self-attributive view and the self-evaluative view. What we want to defend is something alternative to them. Apart from this, those claims could have different patterns of answering. So, if this notion of access can be understood as not reducible to knowing or controlling, thus the pattern of answers is going to be different too. So we are going to use these claims, in particular we are going to emphasize claim 4, we are going to use only claims 1, 2, 3, as a way to contrast the self-mind-shaping view with the alternatives. So this task is clear. So now for the mind-shaping view. Well, the mind-shaping view tries to defend that what Kaczynski calls the human socio-cognitive syndrome, meaning the number of socio-cognitive abilities that we have as humans, such as the ability to understand each other, to cooperate, and the like, are not the product, as many people think, of our mind-reading abilities, but are the product of a number of abilities that we have to shape the social environment, and at the same time making our own mind, making the minds of everyone conform to this social environment. So, folk psychological competence, the competence of attributing our self-beliefs, desires, and the like, is not only a capacity for explaining and predicting the other's behavior, but it requires deploying regulative practices. Those mind-shaping procedures are regulative practices. And here's a quotation by Victoria McGeer that is pretty illustrative. She says, "We overlook the way folk psychology operates as a regulative practice, molding the way individuals act, think, and operate so that they become well-behaved folk psychological agents." I mean, it is because we comply with the restrictions of folk psychological practices that we are predictable and understandable in folk psychological terms. So agents that can be well predicted and explained using both the concepts and the rationalizing narrative structure of folk psychology. So those dispositions are both biological and ecological. Human beings are biologically and ecologically predisposed to learn and teach cultural and rational norms and complex cultural patterns of behavior that enhance cooperation and structurally complex social projects. So this is the structure that we build for ourselves so that our social interactions are more easy to handle. So those norms and patterns facilitate the prediction and explanation of our behavior. Now we are going to mention just a few of the mechanisms that Salinsky presents as examples of the mind-shaping mechanisms that we have at our disposition. The idea is to show later in the next section how those mechanisms can be adapted for the self case, how we have also mechanisms that can be used to serve our own mental states based on basically on the same principles as the social mind-shaping mechanisms. So there are 4 kinds that we want to mention. The first kind is imitation. The idea is that imitation, reproducing someone else's behavior, and especially in the case of humans, over-imitation, facilitates the acquisition of patterns of behavior, and this in turn facilitates social interactions, because if I imitate you, then there's a behavior that is getting increased reproduction in the environment, and then it's more likely that you will imitate this behavior too, and that the behavior will spread in the social environment. And this will enhance prediction. This will make everything more predictable, because we expect certain behaviors to be there. They also facilitate the homogenization of behavior in a specific context. The behavior will be more similar. This way it would be easier to predict. Well, the second mechanism is pedagogy, teaching in general. And there are two types of pedagogical mechanisms that Sadisky discusses. One is one comes from the mechanisms of natural pedagogy that help the infant to acquire certain behaviors from their caregivers. For instance, mechanisms that involve eye contact with the caregivers that provide a signal to attend to the subsequent behavior. Those are mechanisms that we have naturally to mark that a teaching process is coming. The second pedagogy mechanism comes from the reflection in Vygotskian tradition, and the notion of zones of proximal development that would provide a kind of cognitive scaffolding that can be progressively internalized by the agent that is learned. So those mechanisms are mechanisms that also help to shape the minds of others. Notice that there is always in mind shaping a target, which is a mind that you want to shape. And imitation, when I imitate you, the target is in fact my own mind. And when I teach you, the target is your mind. So you have, you can see that there are always, as we will see later, you can begin to see that there are elements of self-mind shaping already included in the picture that Sadisky is presenting. The third mechanism is conformity. Conformity comes also in two basic varieties. One is behavioral conformity. I mean, I conform to the behavior. That is possible due to unconscious automatized mechanisms to match each other's gestures, posture, and the like. This is like more or less unconscious imitation. Like when you are speaking, you are talking to somebody, and you do like this, and the other guy do like this, and this is something that is called sometimes the chameleon effect, and that helps to reinforce some patterns of interaction in the social environment too. And the other mechanism for conformity is norm-based conformity. That is, norms that are in the social environment that provide also a mechanism that helps to homogenize individual behaviors to make them more predictable, a particular normative structure. So, for instance, to mention an example, this is related to the tendency to punish non-cooperative or irrational behavior in respect of the cost. And people that break a particular rule or don't respect norms receive sanctions, and these sanctions help to reinforce the social norm and the social norms structure, the social interactions. So also again to make them more predictable. And the fourth mechanism is narrative regulation, which is the practice of engaging in stories and narratives about protagonists who act for reasons, and that enhances the deployment of psychological concepts. So when we talk about, when we make a narration about ourselves or about other selves, we use psychological concepts to explain what they did, but it is not that we are explaining their behavior, we are also regulating the other's behavior according to standards that are socially fixed. So what is the role of mental concepts? This is just to account for something that is already given there. I mean, you have a mental state, a particular belief, so to speak, and I have to know about that particular mental state and make it explicit. the fact is that sometimes I can make those mental states appear. At the same time, I know and I regulate your behavior. By regulating your behavior, I make your mental states appear in your subsequent behavior. For instance, this is when we use psychological concepts in this way, when I attribute you a particular belief and I tell you that you have that belief, or especially when my attribution is something like an action-oriented mental concept, then I'm not explaining something, but I am making you, I am compelling you to act in the terms of the mental attribution that I already made. And then we adjust our behavior according to the patterns that are expectable under the attribution of such mental concept. For instance, and this is more notable in the self case, if someone attributes a belief to herself in public, then she will regulate her behavior in order to fulfill the expectations derivated from the belief, and then she will make her mind go in a certain direction with certain mental states and not others. I will not read the full quotation by Maria, but only the last part. She says, "We are engaged in the activity of molding our behavior, cajoling, encouraging, reprimanding, promising, and other ways, giving ourselves over to the task of producing comprehensible patterns of well-behaved agency in ourselves and others from both psychological point of view." So now our idea is just to try to adapt this very basic framework to the self case for to provide the coherent notion of mind shaping, and now Víctor is going to speak about it.
Okay, so we think that in order to give a coherent notion of self-mind shaping as involving metacognition, we need to defend 3 claims. The first is, I think, the first one is the idea that cognition as inherently social, as Fernando explaining. The idea of mind shaping is the idea that not only we have, our cognition is shaped in such a way that we are going to behave and we are going to think in manners that make us more predictable for others. And in that sense, we could say that an important part of cognition has social origins. The second claim is the idea that those mind-shaping mechanisms can be applied to ourselves, not only to a third person, but to yourself. And the third claim is the idea that this self-mind-shaping implies metacognition, but metacognition in the sense that is in a sense that is regulative and conformative. It's regulative because of it's a regulative process in the sense that you control your cognitive trajectory by setting a number of constraints, but at the same time you help to conform those mental states according to those trajectories. So in this sense, we think that metacognition is a way of attributing mental states, but not by introspection or by inferring previous mental state, but generating expectation about what those states ought to be, and then living up the expectation that we generate. When you try to develop this idea of self-mind shaping, you have to approach 2 difficulties. And the first one is you have to see what are the relevant differences between mind-shaping mechanisms when they are applied to a third person and then when they are applied to yourself. And the second one has to do with this idea of in which sense applying those mind-shaping mechanisms is a question of, or it's a matter of metacognition. So, in the case of imitation, as Fernando said, we have those mechanisms that many of them are automatic, especially when you are like in the sense that you have to copy a model, and those mechanisms could be automatic and even unconscious. But if you take the idea of self-imitation, like in the sense that Rorschach defined it, that is the idea that self-imitation is the systematic attempt to reproduce and match previous pattern of self-generated action. So when you have to imitate some kind of pattern of behavior that you that you did before, this imitation cannot be automatic in the same sense. In the same sense that it's automatic the imitation of others, because you have to reproduce the cognitive process that causes this behavior. So there is in a sense where the self-imitation requires metacognition. In the case of pedagogy, we have two problems to talk about self-pedagogy. The first one, of course, is the conceptual problem that pedagogy seems requiring an asymmetry between the teacher and the pupil. You need someone who knows something in order to, and another person that is the target who need to acquire the knowledge. And the other problem is the empirical problem, because as Fernando said, Sawinski talked about two main mechanisms of pedagogy. The first one is the Vygotskian zone of proximal development, who seems to provide learning for control, but not for self-teaching. And the second one is this idea of natural pedagogy, where you take like a gaze following or gaze signal in order to copy a behavior or a pattern of behavior or norms. But what we did here was to take the inspiration from Ryle, who wrote a paper titled Thinking and Self-Teaching, where he defends the idea that that learning is to become able to. He tried to draw parallels between teaching and thinking, and say that in fact teaching has to do with attempt new application of acquired patterns, method, reference, and example. The idea is that when you learn something, you are not just reproducing what your teacher do. What you are learning is trying to evaluate in some sense your own mental state and your own processes in order to apply to different situations and different concepts. So in that sense, we think that it makes sense to talk about self-teaching. And if you look at those mind-shaping mechanisms, like the Vygotskian zone of proximal development or the natural pedagogy, from those sides, you can find a way where it makes sense to apply to the self, in the sense that, for instance, when something similar of natural, I mean, you cannot take those gaze following, of course, and apply to yourself, but you can learn some kind of pattern of which kind of studying object in the situation are relevant for your purpose or for the thing that you are trying to do. And in the same vein, what you learn in your zone of proximal development is not something that you have to reproduce all the time in certain situation, but you are learning some kind of pattern or to change cross situation and context. Well, okay, the third mechanism is conformity. Again, we have two different kind of conformity. The first one is the automatic conformity that could be behavioral or cognitive. We think that, of course, not in the behavioral conformity, but in the cognitive conformity, there is some metacognition involved, in the sense that, for instance, when you, in the cases of the line judgment task of Ash, I don't know, do you know those experiments? No? Okay, those experiments are experiments about social conformity, where a subject is in a group, and all the group are actors, except the subject that you want to test, and you show them some lines, some are equal, other are different, and you say to the the experimenters to say to the actors that they have in some point to say the opposite about what they see, and to see the response of the subject. And what's happening is that the subject always don't say what he sees, but actually what the actor said. That is like a social, to show that there is a social pressure on the subject. So we think that if you saw those kind of things from a self-man-shaping point of view, you have here a metacognition, in the sense that you have two different judgments that you have to evaluate. One that has to do with the reflection from the social setting, and the other one about what your other mechanisms, other cognitive mechanisms could provide. Okay, in the case of norm-based conformity, we have two senses in which we can talk about norms. One is the idea that rules are social constraints, and the other one is the idea that norms are some kind of enforcing means. According to the first one, we believe that there is some sort of metacognition involved, in the sense that even when you try to internalize some kind of social norms, you need to adapt those social norms to your idiosyncrasies or your personal way to behave or think, and this implies as well some sort of metacognition. In the second sense, we think that this the kind of enforcement that social norms provide involve metacognition as well, in the same sense that Proust defends the idea that when we are exposed to social settings, sometimes we acquire some kind of noetic feelings, or some kind of feelings about what we are doing wrong when we violate some kind of those social norms. But contrary to Proust, we believe that those noetic feelings have social origins. So the fourth mechanism is the self-narrative. This is probably the most clearly metacognitive. Like probably you know that Daniel Dennett or Berryman have developed some ideas of how narrative can use it by a subject, not only to interpreting others, but to interpreting yourself. And you have to, we think that involves metacognition, in the sense that we need to have access to our previous experience and mental state in order to maintain a coherent narrative, a coherent history about yourself. Okay, so now I'm going back to the three questions that Fernando presented in order to see, in order to contrast the mind-shaping perspective with the Proust and the self-attributive view. So the first question was that if are the mechanisms for accessing our mental state the same as those for accessing the mental state of others? So, of course, there is a sense in which you can say that they are, in the sense that we believe that in order to acquire metacognition, we need to have a mind that has been shaped in a social environment. But contrary to the self-attributed view, we don't believe that mind reading is required. we think that, I mean, that two examples of this. The first one is the narrative one. You don't need really to read your own mind in order to get a narrative about that control in some sense, or that generate expectation about what you have to do in order and this narrative to control your own mind. The same happens with deliberation in some sense. Like if you think in a context of taking a decision or deliberate about what you have to do. So I don't know, imagine for instance that a music band, that two of your favorite music bands are going to play tonight in Vitoria, and you want to go to one of them. What you have to do in order to take a decision is not really to meta-representing your own mind. What you have to do is just to see things like, which album is going to play each band, which place is better to hear them. In a sense, the deliberation is governed by this principle of transparency that said that you don't have to pay attention to your own attitude, but only to the content of your mental state. And in a sense, what you are doing is evaluating the consequences of how you take the work, but you don't need to have an inferential or access to your own mental state. The second question that was related with propositions, that as we saw, Proust defends that you don't need access to proposition or conceptual knowledge in order to have metacognition. And on the other hand, you have self-attributive view saying that you need a complex mental state with the form I believe that P. But in a sense, we think that it's not neither of both. Neither of those. Like because we believe that self-mind shaping requires to have some minimal conceptual capacities, in the sense that you need to, in a minimal sense that we put here, the idea that concepts need to have the feature of centrality, meta-representation that are independent of the stimulus or the inputs, and they are not peripheral. And in the sense that in order to ascribe a concept, we need to say that this agent, that we need to ascribe a belief to this agent, in the sense that we can attribute a concept to a creature in order to explain the behavior. This is the minimal requirements that we believe to need. Sorry. This is the minimal requirements that we believe that metacognition needs. And why these minimal requirements? Because the part of the discussion in metacognition about metacognition has to do with the animal cognition. Proust defends that non-human animals can have metacognition, and that's proof that propositions are not required. And she gives an example that has to do with macaques, and uncertainty, where the macaques have to discriminate two classes of of density stimuli. One is low, the other is high, and they can choose the option or not taking any of those stimuli. They usually choose this option when the intermediate case is so close. So this usually is taken as an example of animal metacognition that do not require proposition. We think that this interpretation is maybe could rule out the possibility of requiring mind reading, but not the mind shaping perspective, in the sense that those monkeys, firstly, are really social. In fact, all these experiments were reproduced with really social animals like dolphins or macaques or chimpanzees or things like that. And secondly, because they are really, they are usually known animals that are well trained in those kind of artificial situations. So the paradigmatic example that we take to be that we take in this case is the case of the hunting strategies in tame chimpanzees. Tame chimpanzees can play 4 different roles when they are hunting, like cooperatively, like chaser, ambusher, driver, and captor. And depending on the role that they take, they behave quite differently, and they change their role depending on the situation where the prey is or where they are. And we take this like a case where firstly you have mind shaping capacities, in the sense that you need to learn and be drilled in really and quite sophisticated social norms. And at the same time we take it to be a case of conceptual, in this minimal sense, of metacognition, because in order to modify the behavior, or in order to have the appropriate responses in the cooperative hunting, the chimpanzees will need to calibrate their behavior and cognition depending on the role they assume. Finally, the third question has to do with the idea that of taking mental state as mental states. As we said, the self-attributive view takes the idea that in order to have metacognition, what you really need is to have meta representation. You need to form a complex proposition where you have the attitude and you have the proposition. You probably know for the example, you see for the examples that I gave or that we gave, we think that metacognition do not require such a meta representation, even though we think that in certain cases it could happen. And I did this example provided by Berkans, but I don't have so much time, so I will see it. So the conclusions are that this that mind-shaping view, first we think an alternative approach to mind reading social cognition, and this view opens a new possibility of understanding the social origins of human cognition, and in particular a new understanding of approaching metacognition. And we have provided reason to support that mind shaping is a serious alternative to both the self-attributive view and the self-evaluative view in metacognition. And we claim that this metacognitive capacity should be understood as a matter of access that cannot be reduced to mere knowing or control. That's all.
So I really enjoyed that. It was really interesting. But I'm just wondering if you could tell me a bit more about mind shaping and why I should believe it, because it always seems to me that kind of move gets things about the mind shaping move in general. Yeah. That it gets the kind of explanatory cart and horse the wrong way round. So the idea is that folk psychology is supposed to operate as a regulative practice, moulding the way individuals act. But it seems to me as if, those regulations are inherent in the way we act because of the nature of what it is to believe something or desire something, or, and then what folk psychology is trying to do is to capture those regulations. It's not clear to me why they're supposed to, Yeah, why the normative bit gets in any way independent of what the nature of those mental states are themselves.
So the question is, in what sense it is independent from mind reading abilities?
Yeah, kind of, or I mean, the things you gave us as evidence for mind shaping, so the imitation, the learning, the conformity, they all look like very different kinds of things to the kinds of folk psychological explanations. So I'm not sure why those kinds of things should give us evidence for thinking that folk psychology has this kind of behaviour regulation.
The first thing to notice that mind shaping doesn't reject the notion of mind reading right away. What the theory tries to offer is a way of understanding how mind reading abilities could appear. So it doesn't reject that we can use mental concepts and attribute mental aspects to each other. What it does reject is that this ability is the basis for other social interaction abilities. The thing is that when you look at actual folk psychological practices, the instances in which you find what the mind reading theory tells you that is happening and attributing a particular mental state or a particular action are usually the exception rather than the rule. The rule is that you are not most of the cases you tend to appeal to the hidden causes like beliefs and desires when there is something unexpected happening. But the strength of folk psychological practice, in theory, is that it is the general explanation that you use for any social interaction, that you are making those automatic inferences in which you infer the mental state of the other so as to explain the behavior, but do this very quickly, mathematically and the like. But the point of missing theory is that you don't need that big apparatus to predict behavior most of the time. Most of the time behavior just comes, comes naturally, so to speak. It's only when something fails. You want to add something?
No, I think that's...
So I'm going to try and argue against that.
Okay, I have a different conception of what the mind-shaping hypothesis is supposed to be. I would have thought that it was associated with the kind of, you might call it anti-realism with regard to propositional attitudes, beliefs and desires. You might have thought, I think in this discerning this point of view, that beliefs and desires are there in the organism independently of what anybody might think about them, and the mentalistic vocabulary enables us to describe those things, and we are to understand the function of the mentalistic vocabulary as being to describe those states that are in the organism, just as we might use shape and color words to describe the shapes and colors of objects. The mind shaper, Zawadzki in particular, doesn't think that we're going to succeed in understanding the role of the mentalistic vocabulary in just that way. Rather, we're going to understand the role of the mentalistic vocabulary only insofar as we understand it as serving this function of social assimilation and control and so forth. Is this not correct? As a characterization of, in particular, Zawadzki's project, he doesn't think of the vocabulary as specifically descriptive. He thinks of the vocabulary as performing, as serving this function of control.
Yeah, but this is not the only function that he recommends. I mean, he said that the developmental trajectory is in that way. I mean, we start to use. He has a Brandomian history about how that's happened, right? That you start to use mental concept when you try to justify, and part of the reason because when you need to justify yourself is because you break or you violate those expectations that people, that others have of you, but he doesn't deny that after that, those kind of concepts can be used to describe any character.
So far as so then I would have thought if you want to talk about self-mind shaping, then you really would focus on Dennett's kinds of examples where he says, I actually don't have a particular point of view, but when you ask me what I believe, I tell you, and at that point, for the first time, I actually have a point of view, and then from then on, I act as though that's my point of view. I try to defend it. I act like someone who has that point of view, and so forth. So you could say a self-description plays this role of enabling us to determine our own nature. But you shouldn't think of it as serving only for me to then to describe, to communicate to you, to make known to you a state that was already there. And it only comes into being when I describe myself that way. But I just didn't catch, there was the allusion to Dennett, but you really weren't, insofar as you were describing, characterizing self-mind shaping, you didn't really focus on this idea of self-determination through the application of the mentalistic vocabulary.
Yeah, this is basically the idea of making those mental states. But those mental states are not there just to describe them, but in a sense they appear in your attempt to knowing whether you believe that be or not. Okay? It's not that, I have this belief somewhere in the back of my mind, and then I'm going to just... No, it appears in the effort of constrained by other beliefs or other states that you attribute to yourself, and it will appear. And it is even more notable in the case in which you are attributing yourself past beliefs. Imagine when you are all the time making stories about ourselves, about what we did and why and so on, but this is really a case in which we have a good grasp of my belief at some point in the past, or it is that just I am making a coherent story that I am telling myself and others, and that constrains my thinking in particular ways. So this is roughly the story of self-mind shaping. By making that story, you compel to behave as the self that your story is making up.
No, exactly. So I want to go back to section 4, just ask about one of the applications, pedagogy. I just wasn't following this. So at first it seems like, you can't apply this to the self because you don't have this gap between the learner and the teacher. But wait a minute, maybe you can apply it to the self. And the way you put it here in the handout was pedagogical mechanisms provide means to know how and where to look. These can be exploited in the self case. This may be just a case of just reading the initial examples differently. I mean, I understand what's happening with Chibra here in richer terms. I think what he's doing is he suggests, it's not just I see someone looking at something and that's a signal that I should look at it. It's I see certain types of cues which act as evidence for generalizable knowledge. This is how people do things. This is something that, look, you better do it this way. So if someone just opens this in the normal way, then it's just physical constraints. But if they do something like, and then open it or something, that's the way it's done. And this turns out to be...
Terminus light on with your head.
That's another example. And this turns out to be a very powerful learning system. But I just don't see how that applies in the self case.
Okay. I mean, when we started to think about all these kind of things, I mean, we are not defending that all the mind shaping mechanisms can apply to yourself. Some maybe, some no. That's an exploratory thing. But I think that part of the point is not that you can apply this in that sense to yourself, but the thing is that when you are learning those kind of when you are in a context or babies or kids are in those kind of contexts, when they are learning are not and then when they are trying to apply to themselves, they are not trying to reproduce, of course, the gaze following or the over imitation or whatever. But what they have learned in those contexts is precisely how to approach the context or the thing to do. And it's in that sense where we talk about that it's not really a self-pedagogy, but it is, but in the sense of right, not in that you are reproducing exactly what's going on there, but you are learning how to approach the situation, I think.
Well, I guess what I meant is that also the functions are different. So the function in the kinds of core cases that are being discussed here is to extract generalizable knowledge. But if you know whatever the phenomenon is, then then you just know it. You don't have
that's the concept of problem, and that's where we think that Ryle helps. What Ryle does is making this analogy. Suppose that you are a teacher, and I am a teacher, you are a learner, and I teach you something in a model in which what you have to grasp is my information, so to speak. Teaching and learning is a matter of just reproducing whatever the teacher has in mind. And then he says, well, imagine that you are the teacher and you forgot the answer. And then you began to work up the answer with the learner. He says, this is something that happens in the self case when you are thinking about a particular problem and trying to work out the solution. And in fact, when what you are internalizing from the teaching situation is good ways of deliberating, good ways of thinking, good procedures of where to look, of what to consider, what is relevant, and you have to be able to extend those procedures to other cases. Otherwise, it is not learning at all. Reproducing your behavior is not learning. Learning is being able to apply that what you have learned to new situations. Learning is not only knowing the Q plus Q equal 4, but to know how to, it's a kind of knowing how. And this is the kind of knowing how that you can internalize the procedures of learning. In fact, what he's doing is his focus is more thinking, in the sense that what he's trying to do is to show that thinking is something similar to processes that occur in the public space, but we are just using it the other way around to show that self-teaching makes sense in this procedural knowledge.
I just think you should remove the pedagogy, because I think in this case what you're doing is you're pointing to a different phenomenon. I think what you're describing is sort of mechanisms in which you could prompt yourself to learn about procedures that might be useful to you or that you've done in the past. But you're not learning about the way things are done in a community or anything like that.
Yeah. I apologize if I make a question which is misplaced, because I got stuck very early on in understanding the talk, but not because of your fault, because I understand his position. I think I understood your position more than his. But there were two things which struck me. One is that you seem to insist incredibly on the relation between beliefs and behaviors. And we keep insisting on these aspects of, for example, we need to, what are you basically take the position of the whiskey, and you try to basically apply it to yourself, essentially. That's what you're doing. No? And the position assumes certain kinds of things about beliefs that I feel uncomfortable, so that's what I wanted to ask you. For example, and my real worry is, are you hiding what you're trying to explain? That's my real worry. And let me just give you an example. Imitation mechanisms, okay? Imitation mechanisms have been shown not to really have anything to do with behavior, but to have something to do very deeply, and this is about same, you gave the examples that you were giving about the head touching, they imitate goals. So what infants understand when they understand the limitation is not that they have to imitate the behavior, that's really just very peripheral, and every animal will do it. But they understand that they have to imitate goals in a way which is completely, totally generalizable to things that they had never seen before. Right? So now if you try to discharge outside things like the creation of your own awareness of your own mind and your own internal states by using this kind of mechanism applied to yourself, essentially. But this mechanism assumes that you already understand goals, right? I don't see how we can do it without giving an explanation of goals, which requires propositional attitudes and all these kind of things. That's my real worry, no? And
This point here, that is precisely one of the points, that there can be a sense of goal as opposed, for instance, to desire, which is a prototypical mental state, a sense of goal in which goal is not a propositional attitude at all, and it doesn't involve a proposition.
Well, but that's the second word I have. That only considers a very limited, a partial part of the problem to explain. Let me give you another example. Beliefs attributions to others, which actually come with a lot of metacognition. I can think that he believes that there are no transfinite numbers. And I'm pretty sure, therefore I have metacognition about that, because I know he's an intuitionist, so he thinks that certain kinds of theorems don't make sense. No behavior at all, but this is a completely good application of attribution of beliefs, which comes with our metacognitive ability and so on. So if you are considering the partial aspect of what you want to explain, and then you don't, I don't understand the generality of what you are claiming. Right? Because there is all this stuff.
The religion doesn't deny that you can do stuff like that, like saying that somebody believes this or that, or that you yourself believe this or that. What it claims is that that ability is not basic. It's not the foundation of your social cognition abilities. Rather, it is something that you obtain by having your mind being shaped by forces that are social inherent.
But I don't see the social forces there, and I don't see the social forces and the structure in the moment in which you understand that what you're trying to do when you, as it were, conform to the external thing, is to basically understand what people are doing in realizing their goals. Now, if you don't have an explanation of goals, which requires propositional, it seems to me that you're just really hiding there what you need to explain. Because even if I consider, mechanisms which are, as it were, completely social, that requires to understand that the attribution of the propositional attitude to you cannot say to me, no, but this has become, I don't see how we can actually get the engine started. That's what I'm feeling. But again, if you think that what I'm saying is really too far from, I don't claim to have a complete understanding of what I'm saying.
But they think there's a kind of understanding that doesn't rest on the attribution of propositional attitudes.
Okay, but that's the problem is so
right? You can.
So this when you.
So when it is, when it comes to attributing the belief about transfinite numbers or whatever, there's understanding what the guy said. He said some things, and you understand what he said, without already in understanding what he said, attributing belief, and then you can use the attribution of belief to do something beyond just describing what he said, namely. Well, in this case, it's hard to imagine, but imposing some regularity on his behavior.
The idea is that some of
the regularity here, that he goes to meetings of intuitionistic mathematicians. It's just.
Yeah, or for instance, that you ask him, do you believe in something very simple. If you ask him, do you believe in transfinite numbers? He would say no. There are some expectations. I don't know what kind of expectations you can get from somebody being a transfinite.
In other ways, he shows himself to be an intuitionist. But he never really thought about this consequence of it. And then you ask him, well, do you believe in transfinite numbers? And he says, oh, well,
take a different example.
I guess I don't.
I'm not sure what goes with transfinite number, but to see a different example. Somebody, you think that somebody is racist or something like that. and then you have some expectations about his or her
Point is that
behavior.
these are simple cases. What I'm trying to make are cases in which there is no immediate consequence of belief attributions, but there is at the same time a lot of metacognition.
But there is some other implication. That, I mean, not only behavior, but other kind of belief.
Right, and how do you get them socially? That's my question.
Sorry?
How do you get them socially? How do you get them from imitation, from...
Okay, because because imitation and all this kind of thing are kind of low levels at the social cognition, but at the moment that you start to learn language and you can give an history of how you acquire language without mind reading capacities, then you start to sorry?
Okay, sorry.
Then you start to use language to ascribe beliefs in that sense. Right?
Okay.
That's part of this.
Very short question. Okay. Speakers and don't leave before getting the information for dinner.
So for dinner, do you want me to pick you up at the hotel, or do you think we could meet somewhere in the city center, like in Plaza Virgen Blanca, where we were yesterday at the Cafe W? It's really easy to get from the hotel. It's just
Definite place.